Thank you. Thank you. Good evening. Good evening. It is a thrill to be back in Little Rock. It's been a couple of years since I was last here. I've met a couple of people who actually came over to the library when I was here speaking at the library, and it's great to be back in Little Rock, and it's certainly a thrill to be here as part of the William J. Clinton lecture series, distinguished lecture series. And when I got that email from Nikolai saying, we want you to come and be a part of this lecture series, I thought it was a practical joke. It's like, man, this is not funny. I'm looking at this list of people who have come and participated in this series, and I'm like, me? You know, all these great names, and Bob Kendrick, I'm like, he's got to be kidding. And so, but he wasn't kidding, and so we started talking, and obviously, what an honor for me to be here tonight to talk about the Negro League Baseball Museum, and of course, the Negro Leagues, and Negro Leagues history in general. And that museum in Kansas City is special. It is truly a special place. And we were talking, as I was sitting talking with Nikolai, the museum itself started in a room that probably wasn't as big as this room. And guys like the late, great John Buck O'Neill and other local Negro Leaguers who were living there in Kansas City at that time literally took turns paying the rent in that office to keep our hopes and dreams alive of someday building an institution that would not only pay tribute to the history of the Negro Leagues, but a wonderful piece of Americana, a story of American history that had for so long gone untold. It was almost like it never happened. It's a story that is uniquely Kansas City's, but it is really Kansas City's gift to the rest of the world. This story, of course, would begin in Kansas City in 1920. And of course, the Negro Leagues would go on to operate for 40 years, from 1920 until 1960. Legendary Negro Leaguer Chet Brewer, who was from Leavenworth, Kansas. Chet Brewer was a great pitcher in the Negro Leagues. He pitched in, I think, about 10 different countries. He was the first American to pitch in Mexico. And Brewer was outstanding. Anyway, Chet Brewer tells a wonderful story about the challenges and struggles of what it was like for these men to play baseball, but their love of the game. So he tells a wonderful story about this black kid who every day would come up and he would pester this white manager of this all-white team to let him play. Every day, and of course, the white manager would shoo him away. You know you can't play. And so finally, the white manager was fed up. He said, I'd had enough of this. And so this kid comes up. He says, when he comes up today, I'm going to put him in. So sure enough, it's a tight situation, bases loaded, 2 outs. He decides he's going to bring this kid into the game and show him up now. And so he brings the kid grabs the first bat that he could get. He goes up to the plate, pitcher throws him one. He lines it into the gap. And as he's round, the guys are coming in to score, he's rounding the bases. The white manager comes out of the dugout, he says, look at that Cuban run. And from that day, that kid went from a poor black kid without a job to a Cuban with a job. And that's baseball, and that was what the Negro Leagues were like. It was really about a love of the game. There's a wonderful passage inside the museum when you come to Kansas City that simply says, my son, if you aspire to be a servant of the Lord, prepare yourself for testing, set a straight course, and keep to it, and do not be dismayed in the face of adversity. You see, that was Negro Leagues baseball in a nutshell. These athletes loved the game of baseball so much that they were willing to endure whatever social adversity confronted them as they traveled the highways and byways of our country just to play baseball. That passion would not only change our game, but it would change our country. And that's the wonderful story that's documented at the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. You know, it is amazing. I tell people all the time, I think the story of the Negro Leagues embodies what we deem to be the American spirit, unlike any story in the annals of American history. You see, it's everything that we pride ourselves about being American, because this is about pride. It's about passion. It's about perseverance. It's about the refusal to accept the notion that you're unfit to do anything. So in the case of these great athletes, you won't let me play with you, then I'll just create a league of my own. That league, the Negro Leagues, would rise to rival, and in many cities across this great country of ours, surpass Major League Baseball in popularity and in attendance. They were actually outdrawing many Major League Baseball teams. The Negro Leagues guys would become the 3rd largest black-owned business in this country. trailing only black-owned insurance companies who emerged during that era of segregation and would insure African Americans more than the 10 or 15 cents that the white insurance companies would insure us. During that era, white insurance companies would insure me a 10 or 15 cent policy, just enough to bury me. Then black-owned insurance came about and not only insured my livelihood, but insured my stock, insured my crop, insured my home. As a result, made millions of dollars. Next, of course, was Madam C.J. Walker, who would become this country's first self-made businesswoman millionaire of any skin color. Now, I see a couple of sisters in here. I know they know Madam C.J. Walker. Now, the fellas, y'all might not know who Madam C.J. Walker was, but you should. As I said, she would become this country's first self-made businesswoman millionaire. And you know how she did it? Doing black hair. Doing black hair. Madam C.J. Walker had schools of cosmetology in every major urban city in this country, and she made millions, the first to actually earn it with a business structure. Next was Negro League Baseball. And as Nathan alluded to, my dear friend, the late, great John Buck O'Neill, if he was here, standing here tonight, he'd tell you all you needed was a bus, 2 sets of uniforms, and you'd have 20 of the greatest athletes who ever lived. They could play. And truthfully, guys, their contemporaries knew that they could play. It was simply the social conditions of our time and fear that kept them out. So they created a league of their own, right there in Kansas City, at the old Paseo YMCA, the birthplace of the Negro Leagues. So that's why it made sense that a museum dedicated to this subject matter be in Kansas City, because the YMCA building is just 2 blocks from where we currently operate at historic 18th and Vine. That is where Rube Foster, the architect of this whole thing, brilliant man, he and a contingent of 8 independent black baseball team owners met in Kansas City. They signed the documents to start the Negro National League, the first successful organized black baseball league. As I mentioned earlier, the Negro Leagues would operate for 40 years, from 1920 until 1960. That surprises most of the folks who come to visit us, because most of them can relate the fact that Jackie Robinson breaks the color barrier in what year? 1947. I know these folks at the Clinton Library, School of Public Policy, all smart. I knew they knew that. 1947, Robinson breaks the color barrier in 1947, 13 years after the Negro Leagues finally ceased operation. But when we look back historically, it took Major League Baseball 12 years before every Major League team had at least 1 black baseball player. The Boston Red Sox were the last team to integrate in 1959 when they signed a player by the name of Pumpsie Green. So that is what afforded the Negro Leagues an opportunity to continue to do business, because it took Major League Baseball so long. Most just assumed that when Robinson breaks the color barrier, if there was a Negro League, surely it would have ended at that point in time, but it didn't. It was a very slow, meticulous process before every team had at least 1 black baseball player. By 1960, the league ceased operation, because now most of the best young black stars had moved into the major leagues or into their minor league system, and there was no replenishing system. Really, black owners, seeing the handwriting on the wall, started selling their star players to the major leagues, trying to get what they could, because they knew the business of black baseball was going to die. And so Robinson was not only the beginning, he also spelled the end of the Negro Leagues, because now there was really no need for 2 leagues operating simultaneously, when you had an opportunity for the best players now to take the field and compete with and against each other. It is an amazing, amazing story. This story is so much bigger than the game of baseball. It's just, baseball is really just a premise for a much grandiose story. But for those who come there expecting to meet some great baseball players, you're going to leave not being disappointed. You're going to meet some of the greatest baseball players who ever put on a uniform, players that we should have known. And I heard Nathan allude to the fact of Satchel Paige, and we'll talk a little bit about Satchel in just a minute. But you also should have known about the likes of Buck Leonard, whom many believe to be the greatest first baseman to have ever played this game. Now, for those of you who are fans of Major League Baseball, Leonard was compared to Lou Gehrig. And I know Bob's a Yankee fan back there. He was compared to Lou Gehrig, but he was believed to have greater defensive abilities than Gehrig. And the old timers in the Negro League say the greatest fastball hitter this game has ever seen. They say trying to sneak a fastball past Buck Leonard was like trying to sneak sunrise past a rooster. You couldn't do it. He'd sit dead red and wouldn't miss. My good friend Buck O'Neill tells me a story. Old Satchel was on the mound, and he had thrown Leonard about 4 consecutive off-speed pitches. Leonard was a left-hand hitter. He had ripped him down the first base line, foul. So now Satchel's going to try to sneak a fastball past Buck Leonard, and Buck O'Neill says Leonard hit the ball so hard down the first base line that it ripped the webbing out of his glove. He calls time. He goes over to the mound. He says, "Hey, man, don't you throw him another fastball today. You're going to get me killed over here." You should have known about the likes of John Henry Pop Lloyd, whom Babe Ruth called the greatest baseball player he had ever seen. Lloyd was a great shortstop in the Negro Leagues. Many believe Honus Wagner to be the greatest major league shortstop of all time. Honus Wagner called Pop Lloyd the greatest that he had ever seen. He revolutionized the position. Big man who was playing in the middle of the infield, great range, soft hands, lots of power. I was touring Derek Jeter through the museum, and I said, "You know, Jeter, you kind of like Pop Lloyd." He says, "No, I don't have the power that Pop Lloyd had." But it built in that same mode, about the same size of a Derek Jeter or an Alex Rodriguez when he was playing shortstop, or Cal Ripken. Big guy, soft hands, lots of power, great range. You should have known about the likes of course, the legendary James Thomas, Cool Papa Bell. Still believed today to be the fastest man to ever play this game. Clocked him in 12 seconds, circling the bases from home to home. His good friend Satchel Paige, of course, said of Cool Papa Bell that he was so fast he could walk in the room, turn off the lights, get in bed, pull up the covers before the room went dark. That is actually a true story. Cool Papa Bell and Satchel were teammates on the great 1935 Pittsburgh Crawfords. Some say the greatest baseball team ever assembled. They had 5 future Hall of Famers playing in their prime on that great 35 team. So they had Satchel, Cool Papa Bell, Josh Gibson, Judy Johnson, and Oscar Charleston on the same team at the same time. Dynamite team. So when they traveled, they were roommates. Cool Papa and Satchel were roommates. So in this particular instance, old Cool gets to the hotel room before Satchel does. He walks in the room, he turns on the light, there's a delay before the light comes on. He flips the light switch off, there's a delay before the light goes off. So Cool says, When Satchel gets to the room, Cool's waiting for him. "Roomie, I'm so fast, I can flip this light switch off, I can run over, hop in bed, cover up before the room goes dark." And Satchel's like, "Cool, you fast, but you ain't that fast." And so Cool Papa Bell bet his meal money, and Satchel took the bait. And because that light had a shortage in it, and one of the greatest sports pranks of all time, Cool was able to flip that light switch off, run over, hop over, and cover up before the room went dark. Satchel was so outdone that he just always told folks that Cool was that fast. But that's how that story came about. But I tell you what, you don't have to fictionalize the speed of Cool Papa Bell. Cool Papa Bell once stole 175 bases in a 200-game season. He twice scored from first base on a bunt in exhibition games against Major League All-Stars. See, plays like the bunt and run, hit and run were actually created in the Negro Leagues, perfected, and then later picked up by Major League Baseball. They're playing in Mexico, and Cool Papa Bell goes from first to third on a single so fast that the Mexican team stopped the game because they swore he had cut across the diamond, that no man could get around the bases that quick. His speed was legendary. The old timers in the Negro Leagues will tell you, if he hit a two-hopper to the left side of the infield, forget about it. You had no chance to get it. If he bunted it back to the pitcher, the infielders would all start saying, "Hurry," because otherwise you had no chance to get him. How fast was Cool Papa Bell? The legendary track star Jesse Owens would never race Cool Papa Bell. Refused to race Cool Papa Bell. Now, Owens would race horses around the bases, but not Cool Papa Bell. Owens raced the fastest major leaguer of that era, beat him easily, but not Cool Papa Bell. Satchel says, had colleges known about Cool Papa Bell, or if Cool Papa Bell had known about colleges, he would have made Jesse Owens look like he was standing still. You should have known about the likes of Oscar Charleston, who I mentioned earlier, whom my good friend Buck O'Neill says without hesitation, the greatest baseball player he ever saw. He believed Willie Mays to be the greatest major leaguer of all time. And of course, Mays' career began in the Negro Leagues with the Birmingham Black Barons. But he believed Oscar Charleston to be the greatest baseball player he'd ever seen. Charleston was an early era Negro leaguer who could do everything. Hit for power, hit for average, could field, could run, could throw. In 1921, Oscar Charleston led the Negro Leagues in home runs, triples, doubles, stolen bases, and batting average in the same season. Again, if you were going to compare him to a major league contemporary, he had the defensive abilities of Tris Speaker, the tenacity of Ty Cobb, and the bat of Babe Ruth rolled into one. And Buck says that Charleston was one of the strongest men he ever saw in his life. Says that Charleston could take a baseball, put it between both palms, and turn the leather on the baseball. Just freakishly strong. He played a very shallow outfield. And Buck says he never saw anyone who could go back on a ball the way Charleston could. So you couldn't bloop it in front of him, and unless you hit it on a rope, you couldn't hit it over his head. He'd track it down. Amazing, amazing baseball player. You should have known about the likes of the great Martin de Higo from Cuba. Great baseball player. The only baseball player in the history of the sport to be in 5 different countries' baseball halls of fame. He's in the Mexican, Cuban, Venezuelan, Dominican, and of course, Cooperstown. Played all 9 positions, played all 9 of them well. He could do everything. One year in the Mexican League, he goes 18-2 with an 0.90 ERA. He wins the batting title that same season. He was absolutely amazing. And of course, as Nathan mentioned, for those of you who probably know a little bit about Satchel Paige, he was incredible. I could spend all this time talking about Satchel because there's just so many wonderful Satchel Paige stories. He was, for certain, the oldest rookie in the history of Major League Baseball. Major League Baseball says that he was 42 when he joins the Cleveland Indians in 1948. Cleveland, you may recall, would win the World Series. Satchel was named Rookie of the Year. Satchel was probably closer to 52 than 42. Never told his real age. No one knows for certain how old Satchel really was. And of course, Satchel had all of these great sayings, one of which is, age is simply mind over matter. If you don't mind, it don't matter. And that is how he led his life. And of course, Satchel also would whimsically say, how old would you be if you didn't know how old you were? And so he knew that age did not necessarily define him. And of course, Satchel, being the great showman he was, played the whole age thing up to the hilt. You know, some of you may remember Charlie Finley. Finley would bring Paige back to pitch in Kansas City in 1965 for the Kansas City A's before he moved him out to Oakland. Satchel is reportedly 59 years old at the time. He pitches 3 shutout innings against the Boston Red Sox, giving up only 1 hit in those 3 innings. Great trivia question, 1965 Boston Red Sox. Who got that hit off of Satchel? Very good. I knew these guys over here were going to get it. Yes, Carl Yastrzemski, the only guy to get a hit off of Satchel at age 59, which means he could have been 69 years old, because most who knew him says that he was at least 10 years older than what he claims. We've got his tombstone. His original tombstone resides at the Negro League Baseball Museum. And when you see Satchel's tombstone, there is a question mark by his birthday. He literally took it with him to his grave. But when we talk about Satchel Paige in his prime, they clocked his fastball in excess of 105 miles per hour. He couldn't throw it as hard as he once did by the time he gets to the major leagues, but Satchel had pinpoint control, and he never lost his control, which is why he was still able to get guys out at such an old age. See, Satchel Paige, you'll hear guys who caught Paige will tell you, he didn't warm up using home plate. You know what he would use? A stick of chewing gum wrapper. The catcher would sit the chewing gum wrapper on top of home plate, and Satchel would throw to the chewing gum wrapper. Wherever the catcher moved the chewing gum wrapper, Satchel right on top of that chewing gum wrapper. And as Satchel would say, he worked both corners of that chewing gum wrapper. He never lost his control. You know, as a kid, Paige could knock a bird off of a power line with a rock. And so when they put a baseball in his hand, that was just God-given. Yeah, it was absolutely amazing. By his own estimation, pitched in over 2,600 games. Recorded some 55 no-hitters and only God knows how many strikeouts. He was absolutely amazing. And we talk about this a lot at the museum. Page probably could have easily been the first guy to break baseball's color barrier, and he would not have gone through as much as Jackie went through because Page was a superstar. He was a superstar. Everybody knew Satchel. You know, everybody knew Satchel, and everybody wanted to see Satchel pitch, but Page was too charismatic. Page too closely adhered to the stereotypical depiction of African-American athletes. Yeah, he was way too brash, too outgoing, too charismatic. So Branch Rickey needed the right guy. And so when we talk about Jackie Robinson, and I know many of you know the story of Robinson, it has been well documented, but do you really know the story of Jackie Robinson? Robinson's career began in Kansas City in 1945 with the great Kansas City Monarchs. So, you know, that's something that we're extremely proud of, that it was our city that gave America one of its greatest heroes in Jackie Robinson. Robinson plays in Kansas City in 1945. At the end of the 45 season, signed his contract to play with the Brooklyn Dodgers. He would spend the 46 season in Montreal in the Dodgers farm system, and then, of course, on April 15, 1947, make that monumental walk on the field as a member of the Brooklyn Dodgers, forever changing the game of baseball, but more importantly, forever changing our country. Yeah, you know, there's no question that you can divide the American 20th century into two pieces, before Jackie and after Jackie. He had that kind of far-reaching impact in terms of sparking social progress in our country. But as you can also imagine, the question that is so commonly asked of us, was he the best player in the Negro Leagues? No. No. He wasn't the best player on his own Kansas City Monarch team. And that is not to disparage Jackie Robinson, because he's one of the greatest athletes in American sports history. Robinson, of course, was a four-sport star at UCLA, but he was a much better basketball, football, and track man than he was baseball player, which tells you how talented Robinson was, because he goes on to become a Hall of Fame caliber baseball player. But baseball was his weakest sport. So there were other Negro League veterans who were far superior baseball players to Jackie Robinson. But Robinson was the right man to be the first. He had what I like to refer to as the intangibles that better prepared him to deal with the racial hatred that he would be confronted with. You see, Robinson, because he had already been a celebrated collegiate, he had already been an All-American at UCLA. He was comfortable playing with and against white athletes. So he's college educated. He had served his country. He's disciplined. He would become married. He's stable. All of those attributes would be called upon to deal with that racial hatred. Keep in mind, when Robinson walks out on that field, he is called everything but, as my mother would say, but a child of God. When he walked up to the plate, they knocked him down continuously. When he would slide into second base, he would oftentimes come up wet where the opposition had spit on it. When the opposition slid into second, they came in spikes high, trying to cut him. They did everything imaginable to break Jackie, but Jackie would not break. You see, some of those other Negro Leaguers who had been so acclimated to segregation, they couldn't have handled that. Had you thrown a black cat when Willie Wells walked out on the field, his natural instinct would have been pick the black cat up, throw it right back where it came from. But then the naysayers would have said, see, I told you they couldn't handle it. But if Robinson couldn't play, the naysayers would have said, see, I told you they weren't good enough to play in this league. So Branch Rickey had a double difficult task of identifying the right guy, because failure was not an option on either side of the equation. If Robinson couldn't play, this thing is over with. If Robinson couldn't take it, this thing is over with. It would have been another 10, 15 years before another black man would have gotten that opportunity to play in the major leagues. And as I always tell our visitors when they come, Jackie's not playing for Jackie. He was literally carrying 21 million black folks on his back. Had he failed, an entire race of people would have failed. That's an enormous amount of pressure for any one man to have to bear. And then you throw in the fact that he couldn't stay in the same hotel as his teammates. He couldn't eat in the same restaurant as his teammates. Yet he was expected to walk across those lines and compete at a level equal or exceeding his teammates just to be there. What Jackie was able to do in the face of adversity is absolutely amazing. It really is. I still marvel at how courageous he was, playing a game that is tough enough to play under the best of circumstances with this kind of weight on his back. And yet he goes out so valiantly and performs at a level that was just absolutely phenomenal. That, of course, would then open the door for those other groundbreaking athletes to get that opportunity. And so I tell people all the time, if you can imagine baseball without Hank Aaron, without Willie Mays, without Don Newcomb, without Minnie Minoso, then you can imagine what this game was like before 1947. You know, and really I think what Robinson's role was the beginning of what we now know to be the modern day civil rights movement. This is 1947. This is before Brown versus the Board of Education. This is before Rosa Parks' refusal to move to the back of the bus. As Buck O'Neill would so eloquently say, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was only a sophomore at Morehouse College when Robinson signs that contract to play with Brooklyn. President Truman would not integrate the military until a year after Jackie. So really, for all intensive purposes, this is what started the ball of social progress rolling, baseball. And our country literally jumped on the coattail of baseball. It is an amazing, amazing, transcending story. And for years it had gone untold until we started this little museum in Kansas City that nobody said had any chance to survive. And here we are 22 years later, continuing the effort to not only educate our young people about this piece of history, but I truly believe inspire them. And I tell people all the time, when you walk through that museum, you're going to walk away with a newfound appreciation for just how great this country really is. Because the story of the Negro Leagues could have only happened in America. And even though it is anchored in the ugliness of American segregation, out of segregation rose this wonderful story of triumph and conquest. And that's what makes this so special and so awe-inspiring. It is an amazing story, and I tell people all the time, if you walk away with nothing other than this, what the Negro Leagues teaches us is very simple. If you dare to dream and you believe in yourself, you can do and be anything you want to be. These men only dared playing baseball. They had no idea that they were making history. They cared nothing about making history. They just wanted to play ball. But their love of this game, the passion, the pride, the perseverance that was demonstrated by these great athletes literally changed the course of American history in this country. And for that, we owe them a great deed of debt and of gratitude. And that is what we do every single day. We're working diligently to make sure that the legacy of the 2,600 men and women who played in this league, and yes, there were women, and I'm hoping somebody will ask me a question in the question and answer aspect of this, to make sure that their contributions to the game of baseball is remembered forever, but more importantly, the contributions to our society is never forgotten. So again, guys, on behalf of the entire staff of the Negro League Baseball Museum, and certainly in memory of my dear friend, I want to thank the School of Public Policy for allowing me to be here, Nikolai for the invitation and the opportunity to be here amongst you all tonight. What an amazing privilege and honor for me to have a few minutes to talk about Negro League history. I know I've got a little time for you guys to ask me some questions, and if I don't know, I'll lie and act like I do. And as the immortal Satchel Paige would say, you know, if you're going to tell a lie, make sure you rehearse that lie. And if the lie doesn't sound good to you, it probably ain't going to sound good to anybody else. So these lies that I've been telling y'all tonight, I've been rehearsing these for a while. So thank you guys for allowing me to be here. It has been truly an honor. Thank you so much.
But a great story of civil rights.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Thank
Absolutely.
you. That was very powerful, and particularly the timeline that you laid out. All right, let's, we have some questions. Bob, right here, right back here at the back. Wait for the microphone, Bob.
How did World War II affect the league compared to the white player league?
It had an impact, and that's a great question, because we talk about this, and this is something that we focus on. There were quite a few Negro League players who served in World War II. Didn't have the same impact, though, that it had on Major League Baseball. It basically crippled Major League Baseball, but the superstars of the Negro League were too old to serve. So the guys like Gibson and Page were still playing, and what we saw were at Negro League games, you had huge crowds in the early 40s. And that's because you had this superstar talent. So you had a lot of white fans who really gravitated to Negro Leagues baseball over that time. Now, you always had a white fan base with the Negro Leagues, but it was certainly heightened during World War II. And what I always find an interesting juxtaposition about that, at Negro League games, we sat together, side by side, watching, truthfully, the most entertaining, some will say the very best baseball being played in this country. Major League games were separated by chicken wire. Black fans sitting in an isolated part of the ballpark on one side, white fans sitting in the other section of the ballpark. But it certainly had an impact, not nearly the kind of impact, though, that it had on Major League Baseball. But, you know, guys like Buck O'Neil, Monty Irvin, Ernie Banks, all these guys fought, you know, and served their country. And a lot of the young Negro League players certainly served their country. But the superstars, the Josh Gibsons, the Satchel Pages, the Cool Papa Bells, were still playing during World War II and drawing a huge fan base.
You got a question?
Hello, my name is Maggie. I'm a student here. Thank
Hi,
you
Maggie.
so much for coming. My classmates and maybe Dean Rutherford know I don't really know a lot about sports, but I'm trying to learn, so sorry if these questions are silly. But my first question is, what happened in 1960 when the teams were supposed to be integrated? What happened to all the players that didn't get on teams? And my second one is, could you speak a little bit about the women?
That's a great question, and that's what I alluded to earlier. Robinson was the beginning, but he was also the end, because it spelled the end for the Negro Leagues. And what we saw happen was Major League Baseball started grabbing the young stars from the Negro Leagues, but that older player basically lost their jobs. And so they would have to go to Canada or back to Latin America if they were going to play baseball. And it was really kind of a quandary, because the Negro Leagues really didn't want them because they were too old to be sold. The Major Leagues didn't want them because they were too old. You know, we were talking back in the reading room about Ray Dandridge, who was a great Negro Leagues player, probably the greatest third baseman to have never played in the Major Leagues. Dandridge was outstanding. Well, Dandridge makes it up to the old Minneapolis Millers when he was 38 years old. And he was there at the same time Willie Mays is there. And when they came to get Willie, they were fine with it. Just leave Ray Dandridge alone. That's how good Ray Dandridge was. But there was no place in the Major Leagues for a 38-year-old third baseman. There was no place in the Major Leagues for a 38-year-old baseball player unless your name was Satchel Paige. So these other guys, you know, they really got put out of jobs. And unfortunately, they would have to go, like I said, back to Canada or Latin America if they were going to resume their professional baseball careers. And there were three women to play in the Negro Leagues. We were talking about this back in the reading room. Toni Stone, Mamie Peanut Johnson, and Connie Morgan. They were pioneers in their own rights, along with Effa Manley, women who were prevalent there in the Negro Leagues in the 1950s. Toni Stone would join, all three women played for the old Indianapolis Clowns. We just did a project with ESPN a few weeks ago, back in the end of February. They did a nice expose on Toni Stone being that first woman of professional baseball, competing with and against the men in the 1950s. All three were tremendous athletes. And Toni Stone would actually get traded from the Clowns over to the Kansas City Monarchs, which certainly kind of validates her role as a great athlete. Now, yes, it was a marketing ploy to some extent, because the Negro Leagues were losing their fan base to the Major Leagues, and so they were looking for a way to reach a new clientele, so they hired Toni Stone. But Toni Stone from St. Paul, Minnesota, was a tremendous athlete. She could hold her own in the infield. Buck would say they would throw good riding speed fastballs so that everybody could see them swing the bat, because they wanted to see those women run. Connie Morgan was an infielder, and Mamie Peanut Johnson, who is still with us. She lives in the Washington, D.C. area, was about a 5'3" pitcher in the Negro Leagues. All three were great talent, great athletes, and they certainly had a pioneering role in the Negro Leagues. And he touched on Effa Manley and her role in the Negro Leagues. And I tell people all the time, the Negro Leagues gave women an opportunity to do things in this country before this country gave women an opportunity to do things. It was indeed a very pioneering league.
Yes, question right here.
Bob, could you please talk about Bill Veeck and his attempts to field an all-African-American team for the Phillies, and also the 1945 sham tryout the Red Sox had?
Well, and it was, and not to just pick on the Red Sox, because there were a lot of teams. You know, Larry Doby tells me that he tried to get Cleveland to sign Hank Aaron, Willie Mays, and Ernie Banks. And the scouting report came back and said that Mays couldn't hit the curveball, that Aaron had a hitch in his swing, and that Ernie Banks had no range. Well, we know the scouting report was basically fictitious. They didn't want that many black players on the team at the same time. But can you imagine the Cleveland Indians and how the course of baseball history might have been changed with Hank Aaron, Willie Mays, Larry Doby, Ernie Banks, Satchel Paige on the same team? They certainly would have rivaled those great Yankee teams. And it could have just swung the pendulum in an entire different direction. But again, the scouts then did not want to see that many black players on the team. Veck would have done this. You know it as well as I know, for any of you who know Bill Veck. And I think nobody really took Veck seriously, but Veck would have put together an all-black team. There's no question about it. And I think he would have been successful with that all-black team. And again, as he alluded, Boston kind of staged this effort. They brought Jackie Robinson in and a couple of other guys. Boston, I do believe, did not want a superstar black player. And so when they signed Pumpsy Green, it was almost because they had to sign a black player, and they go out and they sign Pumpsy, who was a good baseball player. But they could have had their choice of great players. They didn't want a great black player. You know, truth of the matter is, some will say they didn't need a great black player. They already had great teams. The Yankees didn't need a great black player. They already had a star-laden kind of team. And even the Yankees go get Ellie Howard, who was a good player, and he became a great Yankee, and they made him a catcher. He played outfield for the Kansas City Monarchs. You know, they converted him to a catcher, which basically robbed him of a number of years because he's playing behind Yogi Berra. There was no way he was going to get to the major leagues playing behind Yogi Berra, and so it took forever before he finally gets up to the Yankees, but then he actually becomes one of the great Yankees when he does get his opportunity. But most of those efforts, you know, there were a lot of teams could have had a lot of great black stars, but they just didn't want to. They got their quota. They brought one up, they brought another one up so that he wouldn't be so isolated, and that was kind of the system that they maintained. But when we look back, the National League was much quicker to integrate. And guess what? The National League was winning all the All-Star games. There's not a coincidence behind that. That's not ironic.
Okay, I think you said Bob?
Bob, yes.
Bob, okay. I read the article in the paper that you were coming down here, and I love to listen to a man that knows what he's talking about, so I wanted to come and get some information from you. I'm working on establishing a Razorback exhibit in our African-American Mosaic Temple Museum here in Little Rock, and wanted to see what the drive in Kansas City parallels in the community of just because it's African doesn't mean that it's not open to everyone.
Yeah.
And how the African-American has changed the sporting world. Now we're the new RGs on the field, not in the stands, but on the field. And what information can you give me of motivation to sell to the community?
Well, and I think it will sell to the community because now, you know, obviously what we're doing, we're talking baseball. And baseball is still America's national pastime. And I don't think there's another sport that is as romanticized as baseball. So the story of the Negro League really kind of adheres to everything that we like about the sport and history. You know, so now all of a sudden, people were learning about these great baseball players. And so they were naturally drawn in. And you may or may not be surprised. I would say 60% of our visitors are white. And really the gap has closed in recent years. It used to be even more disproportionate than that. So what we found is that there's been widespread support for history. If you're preserving history and you're telling these stories, it really knows no racial bounds. People respond to great stories of history. You know, and I think that's what happens at the museum on a daily basis. People come through there and they walk away, while they're excited they had an opportunity to learn about this, they walk away somewhat dismayed that they just now had the opportunity. This wonderful piece of history was kept away from us for so long. You know, and I tell you, you should have known about the fact that night baseball originated in the Negro Leagues. They were playing night games in the Negro Leagues 5 years before they ever played a night game in the major leagues. But our history book is going to tell us that the first professional night baseball game took place in 1935. Crossley Field, Cincinnati, Ohio, St. Louis Cardinals versus Cincinnati Reds. Well, the history book is wrong. The first professional night baseball game took place in 1930 in Muskogee, Oklahoma, and it featured our very own Kansas City Monarchs. J.L. Wilkinson, who owned the Monarchs, literally mortgaged everything he had to pioneer night baseball. He built portable generated light towers. So not only could the Monarchs play a game in Kansas City, they could load them up on the truck and play a night game virtually anywhere. And truth of the matter is, by the time the Cardinals and Reds played that night game, the Monarchs and the House of David had taken night baseball all the way out to Seattle. But as I tell our visitors, you know, and really Wilkinson wasn't doing it to be innovative, he was doing it for survival. They only had Sunday games back then to get crowds into the stadium, so he was looking for a way to get the working class fan into the ballpark. So night baseball became the answer. Night baseball became even bigger than those Sunday games. Sunday games were so popular that black churches would move their service time up an hour. Now, I don't have to tell some of y'all, if you know anything about the black church, you don't mess with service time. 11 o'clock Sunday, go to meeting. When the Monarchs were home, service started at 10 o'clock. Or when the Black Travelers were at home, or even the Claybrook Tigers, when they were home, service started early. We left church going to that Sunday doubleheader looking good, dressed to the nines, as they would say. Well, Wilkie was looking for a way to get the working class fan into the ballpark. Night baseball became the answer. Those night games even bigger than those Sunday games. But here's where the fallacy occurs. American historians never viewed Negro League Baseball as being professional. Thus, the major leagues could get credited with something that had happened 5 years before. And as I oftentimes share with our young audience, it is like Columbus discovering a country that already had people on it. You can't do it. But the moral of the story is this: if you don't control the pen, you don't control the story. Thus, your story is never written with the kind of accuracy or relevancy that it should be. Our museum is about taking control of the pen and finally telling it the way that it should be. Your project is taking control of the pen and finally shining light on those who had not been talked about. But what you'll find is that this is universal. Its appeal will be universal. All you have to do is tell the story. I think if you have passion and inspiration behind what you do, people will follow. You know, our museum has, and always will be, a museum of individuals. The corporate structure has come on board, you know, over recent years, but it will always be a museum of individuals who believe that this story and this history deserves to live on. There's still a lot of those stories left to be told. It sounds like your project is one of those.
All right, got a question.
Well, in that regard, can you explain the decline of the participation of African Americans in the major leagues?
I wish I could. I wish I could. It's a question that, as you can well imagine, we've been asked a gazillion times. And we're trying to find it. We were talking about that in the reading room. We're trying to find out where that detachment came. Because at one point in time, you know, black fans loved baseball. You also had black folks who were running baseball, not just on the field, but every aspect of baseball operation. You referred to in the 70s, the African-American participation at the major league level was probably about 27, 28%, which was in line with the population in this country. Now it's about 8% and declining. And we're trying to figure out where this detachment occurred. I think some are, as we were talking about, socioeconomic factors. A game that was once a blue-collar game is a country club sport now, because those days of sandlot baseball are over. You know, it's not like it was when we were a kid. You got your guys together, you went out and played. Didn't matter whether you had the equipment, didn't matter whatever, you just played. You don't see that anymore. And so once it becomes organized and structured, it becomes very expensive. The gloves, the bats, the shoes, being a part of travel teams to be seen, all of that, I think, has led to this kind of detachment from the sport. Now the proliferation of these other sports didn't help either. Football and basketball have become extremely popular. Football is an expensive sport, but it still draws a lot of kids who gravitate to them. But at the high school level, you're always going to see great high school football. You're not going to see great high school baseball in the urban core. As a matter of fact, in Kansas City, there are a number of urban schools that don't even offer high school baseball programs. So I think all of these kinds of variances have had an influence on what we've seen. But I tell people again, too, that baseball has to become important again in the African American community. When it's important to you, your child plays that sport. There's no question. Now, granted, back during that era, you also had a lot of black businesses that supported kids playing baseball. Every church had a baseball league. Every church had a baseball league. So there were opportunities for kids to play that aren't quite there as much as it was. Now you have programs like the RBI program, which does a wonderful job, and the RBI program in Kansas City is serving almost 1,000 kids every summer, teaching them how to play baseball. But we've got to do more to get kids and create opportunity. We were just talking back, I can't imagine a child not experiencing catching a baseball for the first time, or what it's like to feel that ball hit that bat, because you fall in love with it at that point in time. But there are many kids who have never even picked up a baseball bat or a glove, and that is just heartbreaking to me. So as an institution, we certainly have a commitment to trying to do things to make sure that kids at least have an opportunity to experience it. We also hope by preserving its history, they get an opportunity to come into a place and see people who look just like them, who played this game as well as anyone, as hopefully that impetus and creates that desire for them to want to play. Mm-hmm.
Yes, yeah, let's do this question right here. Let me get, the microphone's coming right behind you.
I have a question. When did baseball actually begin? I've understood through reading that it started back in the 1740s.
It goes back a ways. You know, that's the one thing, we lay claim to about 3 things in this country that we say are ours: baseball, jazz, and barbecue. And we do them all well in Kansas City, coincidentally. You know, it goes back, and blacks playing baseball goes back, we've traced it back to the Civil War, really. You know, so it was not a new phenomenon for African Americans playing baseball. Moses Fleetwood Walker really was the first known black to play on an all-white professional team. This goes back to the late 1800s. He was a bare-handed catcher. Yeah, it didn't last very long before guys like Cap Anson and others basically created a gentleman's agreement. There was nothing ever written, just a verbalized agreement amongst players, managers, and owners that essentially said, if you allow a black player to play with you, you can't play with us. Well, Anson was outstanding. He's in the Hall of Fame. So it was easy for him to build a coalition of followers who shared that same sentiment that would ban blacks from playing on white professional teams for the next 6 decades until Robinson breaks the color barrier.
Got a question right over here. Yes, sir.
I want to kind of follow up on a question a moment ago. What did the Negro Leagues do to develop new players? Was there an organized minor league, or was it, how are they going to find the next Josh Gibson?
Yeah, they never did. And that is what really spelled their demise. Because now you think about it, once baseball opened its doors, and so now that young talent was moving instead to the Negro Leagues, they were moving into the minor league, to the major leagues minor league system. And so that is really what kind of signaled that demise of the Negro Leagues. There was no replenishing system in place, so you couldn't grow. You know, I think at one point some of the teams thought that they might serve as a minor league to the major leagues, but really Major League didn't want anything to do with it because they knew they didn't need it. They knew now that the door was open, they could get that black talent, you know, as much of it as they wanted, truthfully. And so it killed the Negro Leagues, it really did. Yeah, because there just simply was not a replenishing system. You know, and it was really interesting because, again, we really were running our mouth in the reading room because we were talking about the fact that one of the little known facts about the Negro Leagues is that over 40% of his athletes were college-educated men. Less than 5% of those who played in the major leagues at that same time had any college education, simply because the major leagues didn't want you to go to college. They got you right out of high school, put you into their minor league system, and then you work your way to the big leagues. Well, the Negro Leagues didn't have that kind of minor league system. They trained on black college campuses. So, you know, we were talking about it. Pittsburgh Crawfords trained down in Hot Springs, but the Monarchs would train sometimes down in Pine Bluff. You know, so they were training on black college campuses, and so they were recruiting, playing against those black colleges, baseball teams, and then recruit a lot of their workforce from those black colleges which is why they had a disproportionate number of college-educated athletes in comparison to the major leagues. Yet it was those Negro League players who were perceived to be tramps, hobos, illiterate, when actually they were probably more intellectual than their white counterparts. Jackie Robinson walks into a dugout where he was the most intellectual being in that dugout, yet he was subjected to this incredibly harsh treatment and these harsh conditions. And so again, as a museum, our job is to set the record straight. You know, we're trying to break down those stereotypical depictions of these men. They weren't tramps, they weren't hobos. They were very proud men, they were very intellectual, bright men who just happened to love the game of baseball, and they were really good at it.
Horace? Yeah, okay, go ahead.
Take it a step further about RBI, if I can. Is your organization affiliated with RBI in a
Yes.
supportive way? And how do you see, and what is the momentum of that program? Is it building, do you think? Is it doing some good? Because we're starting to see some graduates now that are doing very well. The Upton brothers and shortstop at Philadelphia, Jimmy Rollins, I think, came out of that program. What do you think about that trend now? Because, as you said, a few years ago, it was evaporating.
Well, you know, it has certainly helped. And the RBI program, in its purest sense, creates opportunities for kids to play. You know, it's not necessarily designed to develop major leaguers. It creates an opportunity, however, for them to play. And that is so important, you know, and it's the participation level, and we're affiliated with the Kansas City RBI program, and the participation level is continuing to grow each and every year. But where we lose them at is at high school. And so we're not seeing them move on and say, okay, I'm going to choose baseball over basketball or over football. We're still not quite seeing that yet. Now, every now and then we're seeing some breakthroughs. What I'm more excited about, you know, is what Major League Baseball has started doing in building urban baseball academies. Based similarly on what you see in some of the Latin American countries, they're doing that now in Compton. They're working on a project in New Orleans. I think there's a project in Miami. They're building a project in Philadelphia. This is actually designed to give those kids who really love this sport an opportunity to pursue it at the next level. And so I think it's going to give baseball, again, you know, this is a process. You know, this didn't happen overnight, so the fix is not going to occur overnight. So it means that there has to be a long, steadfast commitment to wanting to not only see kids play this game, but also see the fan base change as well. Because we don't go to baseball games anymore, you know, and so it's kind of a dual-edged sword here, a double-edged sword here. We want to see both happen. You know, I love this game, and I go see the Royals every chance I get. You know, most of the time I'm there, I'm entertaining, so I don't actually get a chance to see the game. But, you know, baseball was always important in my household. And I think that's what needs to happen again. But we love what we're seeing. And I do think that Major League Baseball is committed to getting and giving the best athlete that it can an opportunity to play. And so we hope that the urban kids will explore this opportunity. And, you know, if they so desire to pursue a sport at a professional level, baseball is the best one to pursue.
Got time for one more question, Horace.
Good to see you here. I've had a chance to see the museum a couple of times. My brother lives there, and you're a great spokesman for it.
Thank you.
I would kind of want to answer to...
Thank you.
Answer to the question that Muskie asked, what do you do? Y'all have great exhibits.
Thank you.
Great exhibits. I can vividly still see in my mind the rooms where the players' clothes and how they've dressed and where they got their hair cut. And it just stays with me, and that's what I took from the museum. I was just taken aback by the exhibits because they were so powerful. It was like you just walked in and you could see those guys and you could feel their spirit. So that's what I would say would be the best thing you could do for a museum is to capture that.
That was really important for us because we knew that most of the people, well, actually for us, is we almost de-emphasize the baseball players because for us, it's a given that you're going to come there and you're going to meet some of the greatest baseball players who ever lived, who ever put on a baseball uniform. It was more important for us to bring out that story, those other aspects of what this history represented, so that you could see kind of the culmination of what black baseball meant. So as you make your way through the museum, you actually follow a timeline of American history. And so for our visitor, it becomes an almost all-encompassing history lesson. You come there, you witness the rise and subsequent fall of the Negro Leagues, but you witness the social rise of America simultaneously. And I think that's what makes it such a compelling story. But the story is what drove this. We didn't have a lot of artifacts. You know, we didn't have a lot of memorabilia, but we had a great story, and that story, for the most part, had not been experienced by most of us. You know, we've been doing this for 22 years, and more people are learning. We've piqued the interest of a lot more people, but there are still so many more people who don't know anything about the Negro Leagues, and that is a shame. You know, that we all went through our formal educations without knowing this. And as an institution, our hopes and dreams is that one day we will rewrite the pages of American history books to include this wonderful story in them, so that our kids get another purview of those who helped shape and make this country great. Those stories really have not been talked about, and we need to make sure that these stories are included.
Well, I think it's fair to say that, paraphrasing Maggie's comments, that you don't have to be a sports authority to appreciate the work you are doing and the contributions that you are making. For those of us that happen to love baseball, still remember Don Newcomb and Roy Campanella on the mound and behind the plate. It's a fascinating story, but it's much more than that. And it is a great story about America and civil rights. And thank you for being here. Let's give him a round of applause.
Thank you.